recent years, Brother Billy has conducted several professional training programs for resident and visiting monks at the Buddhist Mahavihara brickfields in the areas of emotional intelligence, communication, professional presentation, public relations, community services, leadership, and management. In sharing the Dhamma, Brother Billy researched discoveries from the fields of neuroscience and psychology to present teachings of the Buddha from a scientific perspective. We shall now invite Brother Billy.
Good morning, brothers and sisters in the Dhamma. Thank you for inviting me to be back at Subang Jaya Buddhist Association once again. This, I think, is my third occasion, and it is always a pleasure to be here. The topic for this morning is the process of perception from a scientific perspective. The motivation behind giving this sharing today is that during the many years I was working as a business development consultant and also as a professional trainer. One of the areas where I do a lot of training is to train people's mind, how to control their mind in terms of strengthening their mind. But during those years, I was not so much exposed to the Buddha Dhamma. So a lot of my material during those years were gathered from the fields of psychology, neuroscience, and various fields of motivational science, and things like that. So I've collected quite a lot of that kind of material. And a lot of this scientific material are actually very interesting to explain what goes on in our brains, what goes on in our mind, and why we react the way we do, and all that. Then, of course, as the years went by, I got to know more and more about the Buddha Dhamma, and I was very fortunate to have met my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji, who actually himself relates the Buddha Dhamma from a very interesting perspective. He's also a psychologist. He's got a doctorate in psychology. So during the lessons I had with him, I was very amazed. Everything that I've collected from the field of psychology and neuroscience are more or less precisely explaining a lot of the teachings of the Buddha. So I was very excited when I showed these things to my teacher. He said, this is right. A lot of these scientific explanations do explain some of the concepts that are spoken about in the sutra, which until today, there was very little scientific evidence to show them. So I was motivated and inspired to share this. So for me, this is not so much a so-called Dhamma talk. I'm not giving a talk or anything like that. I'm just sharing all that I have collected over the years and how it is connected with the Buddha Dhamma. So today, the process of perception is really involving the 5 khandhas, the pañca-khandhas. They call it the 5 aggregates. But of course, my teacher translates it differently. There are 2 very important features in the talk that I'm sharing. The first is that it is very scientific based. So for those of you who may not be too interested from that perspective, just bear with us for a little while. But the second important thing is that I'm using the translations from my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji, who himself translates directly from the Pali Canon. So his translation is direct from Pali into very precise English words, as I will explain later on. So today we're going to explore how this process of perception arises and how it actually causes perceptions in the mind, and because of this, it actually causes us to react. And in the process of this reaction, and this reaction is really tanhā, the way we react to these stimulations. And this reaction actually gives rise to a lot of suffering, stress and suffering. Okay? So we're going to explore the Buddha's teaching from this scientific perspective. First is about how environmental activities, things happening around us in the environment, stimulate our sense organs And this gives rise to this process of perception. Right? This actually triggers the 5 khandhas. And how the mind interprets these perceptions, and this interpretation is the kind of story our mind cooks up. Our mind actually makes up stories as we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something. The mind begins to make up these stories. So this is interpretation. How this interpretation can lead to unconscious emotional arousal. And because of this arousal, we begin to react. And this is how suffering comes to be. And of course, our reaction always carries consequences. So basically, this is the gist of today's sharing. First, we look at ourselves from a Buddhist perspective. When we say, who am I? Now, in the conventional world, the conventional reality is whenever somebody asks himself, who am I? They very often respond by saying, I am so and so, using the name that is given to us. But the name is nothing but a label. So in reality, if we look around us, who am I? Every one of us, who are we? We are really organisms in an environment. That means everything that is happening around us is the environment. And we are organisms struggling in this environment to survive. And this struggling is dukkha. So we're basically organisms trying to survive in this environment. And because of the way we have evolved as human beings, there are 2 very important things happening to us outside our control. The first one is called metabolism. Metabolism is the process that actually sustains the life in our body. We are alive because of the process of metabolism. When the process of metabolism ceases, we're basically dead. We're no longer alive. Or to put the other way, the moment we die, metabolism in the body ceases. So it is this metabolism that is happening in the body that is keeping us alive. And this process of metabolism is very impersonal. It is happening because of the presence of necessary conditions. Right? Strong cells will survive, the weaker cells will die off. These are all happening, and we have no control over these things. We can only influence them in terms of consuming more healthy foods, taking care of our body to minimize injury, right? And that's all we can do. But the second thing happening to us is very interesting. It is called consciousness. Consciousness is again something we cannot control, so to speak. We can learn to cultivate it, but we can't control it. And this is basically the result of our 5 senses, right? Our 5 physical senses interacting with the environment, being stimulated by the environment. And with these 5 senses being stimulated in the environment, it actually gives rise to the 6th sense, which is the sense of the mind or cognition. So these 5 physical senses helps us to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch everything that's going on in the environment. But what's going on in the environment is impersonal. And that's the essence of the meaning anatta, non-self. Everything is happening in an impersonal manner, but we try to personalize it. And that is what I will explore a little further, why we try to personalize things happening in our environment. So when we look at ourselves interacting with the environment as organisms, the environment is a very complicated environment today. Not the same as the way it was during the time of the Buddha. You know, during the time of the Buddha, people talk about traveling to listen to Dhamma talk when they hear, the Buddha or so-and-so is coming to town, giving a talk. Usually people travel from far distances. It may take them 1 or 2 days. So time frame in those days we speak of is in terms of days, travel time. But today, you know, in the modern society, we hear, there is a Dhamma talk going on, and we pop in the car and we drive up there. Within a matter of minutes, we're there. So that kind of conditions are totally different now. It's much, much more stressful, much more pressured than those days. So in order to help us deal with this environment, our body has evolved with a lot of very interesting equipment, so to speak, biological equipment to help us. So the first thing is really the central nervous system. This is really the thing that is helping us sense the environment and respond or react to the environment. At this point, I'd like to just clarify the two terms, respond, react. React is basically when we are stimulated by the environment, we immediately react without thinking, and that is reaction. Reaction is almost like an automatic thing without consideration, without planning, without thinking. Response is a bit different. When we're stimulated by the environment, if we just pause a little while, if we just maintain a little bit of mindfulness of what is happening, and think about what has happened in front of us, and process that thought, and begin to consider our actions, the outcome of our actions, the consequence of our action, before we actually do anything. And then we make a conscious decision to do something in a wholesome way, and that is responding. So it is important for all of us to recognize that when we are stimulated by things happening around us, respond. Right? Pause, think, consider, and then make a conscious decision to take wholesome action. That is responding. But very often we don't do that. Every one of us is guilty of it. You know, every one of us, as long as we are still unenlightened, we are always guilty of very easily reacting to circumstances. This is because of our central nervous system. When things around us stimulate our central nervous system, they actually stimulate various parts of our sense organ. Right? Light stimulates the eyeball. We see something because of light. And then sound vibrate the air waves, and that hits our eardrums, and then we begin to hear something. So we see, we hear, we smell, we taste, we touch. All this comes through our central nervous system, through the peripheral central nervous system, or the peripheral nervous system. They come through our sense organs, and then it is processed in our central processing unit called the brain. So we have a brain which processes this information. But very often, this brain also has an unconscious, emotional aspect of it that reacts without thinking. So in other words, the emotional reaction is the unconscious reaction. And this is usually the first thing that reacts. So if we allow that to react, then we are reacting emotionally. But we are also equipped with a thinking brain called the cerebral cortex. The outer part of our brain is the most evolved part of the brain, and that is the part of the brain that makes us different from animals outside there. So in other words, we are able to think rationally, and it is the use of this thinking capability that helps us understand what we're experiencing, make a conscious decision, what is the right thing to do, and then decide to take wholesome action. That is responding. So the use of the brain to pause and think before responding, that is the rational way to behave. And that is the wholesome way to behave. Instead of reacting like animals. Right? Until we are enlightened, we will always behave as though we are like animals if we don't pay attention to our environmental stimulations. In other words, if we are not mindful about what's going on, we will automatically react like animals. You know? So let's go a little further about how we perceive, how we experience the environment through our process of perception. So we take this little simple example of seeing a ball. You see, every experience that we have is dependent on the presence of necessary conditions. In order to see the ball, not only do we have to be facing the ball and the ball is there, there has to be light. When there is no light, complete darkness, can you see the ball? Of course not. Now, what are we seeing then? Now, here is the reality. And we don't think about this much, but this is the reality. Are we really seeing the ball? No. We are seeing light reflected from the ball. That is what we're seeing. So we're really not seeing the ball, so to speak. Light is reflected from the ball. It strikes our sense organ, which is our eyes. And when we pay attention, there is a process of perception arising in the head. So by paying attention to the stimulus from the environment, this process of perception gives rise to mental images. So there is a mental image of the ball, not because we are seeing the ball, but because we are seeing light reflected from the ball. And this is something we don't think about, but that is the reality. That we are not seeing the object, so to speak. We are seeing light reflected from the object. And I'll explain a little further about the other senses. It's the same thing. You think you're hearing a sound when somebody plays the piano. Are you hearing the sound of the piano? No, you're not. The piano string is vibrating the soundboard in the piano is vibrating the air. The air vibrations enter your ear and strike your eardrum. So what are you hearing? You are hearing air vibrations caused by the piano. Just as you are seeing light reflected from the ball. So when we do that, when that happens, this mental image arises. The mind is very interesting. It actually projects what has been perceived. So the mind actually experiences this. Now, this is really just the experience. The light reflected from the object entering the eyeball, triggering our process of perception, that is the experience. But unfortunately, with this experience, the mind begins to proliferate. The mind begins to project. Projecting there is something out there, right? And this projection actually causes a breakdown between what's inside and what's outside. So this breakdown is called dichotomy, dichotomization, a scientific term. It's like dichotomy means breaking into two separate parts. What are the two separate parts? The subjective part and the objective part. The subjective part is called atta, or some call it self. The subjective self. So whenever we perceive something, what goes on inside, we process as the subjective self. And then the mind projects that I have now seen something out there and calls that the world, the loka, the world out there. Our mind automatically does that until we become enlightened. So for normal mortal minds like yours and mine, we are constantly doing this. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about this process of perception and how we react to that. So we go a little further on this yellow words there, the process of perception. Okay. So when we experience the environment, let's take a look at this whole process of how we experience the environment. Experience is a chain reaction. Right? First, there is the environment. And all the things happening around us, environmental activities, they are stimulus. They stimulate our sense organs. And because they stimulate our sense organs, we are now able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. When that happens, there is this process of perception, the pañca-khandha. This process of perception gives rise to a perception in the head. This word vijnana is translated by my teacher as perception. Very often you will find the word vijnana being translated as the word consciousness. That is also easy to understand. You are conscious of something. But actually, from a scientific perspective, the word consciousness carries a deeper meaning than having seen something. Because at this moment in time, now all this is happening very fast, but I'll just point out one step at a time. At this moment in time, when the environmental stimulations make contact with your sense organs, all that you're having is just a perception of what the senses have been have received. There's no meaning yet. You have no emotions or thoughts or feelings about it yet. So perception is more accurate to explain what has just happened. Consciousness means more than that, actually, from a scientific perspective. The word consciousness carries a sense of self. The meaning that there is a self, all right? So you begin to feel that you have a self. Now, at this moment in time, that self hasn't arisen yet. So the word perception is more accurate to reflect this situation. When this perception arises, vijnana arises, two processes kick in. The first process is the rational cognitive process called mano. That is the process to interpret what has just been perceived. And this process of interpretation of what has been perceived draws on memory of past experiences. If it is something you've seen before, you can interpret what it is. But if you're looking at something you've never seen before, you are puzzled. You have no way of interpreting what it is. So basically, interpretation of what you've seen draws from memory of past experiences. And this drawing from memory of past experiences, scientifically, is called recognition. Of course, if you recognize that word, recognition means recognition. Right? To pronounce it correctly, recognition. And because of recognition, you are now aware there is something you have just seen. The Pali word for this process of recognition is papancha. Right? Papancha actually takes on two dimensions. The first one is the rational papancha, drawing on memory to explain what you have just seen. But there is another kind of papancha which comes later, from the affective process. Because as the cognitive process arises, the affective process arises at the same time. The affective process is called citta. And this is the process which actually carries our mood and temperament. And that begins to interpret the perception from a so-called emotional perspective. For lack of a better word, I will just use the word emotional. But actually it's a little bit more deeper than that. But let's just say emotional. We begin to interpret what we have just seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch from an emotional perspective. And because of this emotional interpretation, it triggers an unconscious emotional arousal. This unconscious emotional arousal comes with biochemical chain reaction. So in other words, there are parts of the body that begin to react. All this is because of the way our brain has evolved. Whenever we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch something, and the brain begins to interpret what has been perceived, the brain itself actually reacts to threats. Many things appear to be threats, but these are not really threats as in somebody threatening your life. These can be something like a loud sound. A loud sound is interpreted by the brain as a kind of threat. And when the brain interprets these threats, it actually triggers biochemical chain reaction. This is called fight or flight reaction. So the brain actually releases hormones or triggers the release of hormones from the glands, from adrenal glands. So the brain sends messages to release hormones, and the hormone causes bodily changes. It causes various parts of your body to react, and therefore there is tension in the body. For instance, when you hear a loud sound, you become spooked and your body jumps a little bit. Or if you're sitting there quietly reading a book, and you are very engrossed in reading the book, and without realizing, somebody comes from behind you and taps you on the shoulder. What happens? You jump, you get spooked. This reaction is the fight or flight reaction. This reaction happens because of hormones. The same thing when you hear words, you may react. I will give you a simple reaction now. I just say the word asam laksa. Some of you will feel sourness in the mouth, right? Yeah? How many of you feel sourness in the mouth? Yes, because of hormones being triggered the moment the brain interprets the word asam laksa. Because your mind says, what is this? This is a very sour soup. How does it affect me? It is sour. And then the brain triggers various hormones. I can even make it worse by describing to you a worse condition like a chalkboard. Remember when we go to school, we use chalkboard, blackboard, and use the chalk to write on the blackboard, squeak, 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 all that sound. And people with long nails, what do? They like to scratch the board, making this squeak sound. Now, how many of you right now are feeling tingling sensations in your body? Yeah? That is because of hormones. You've heard it, it processes it, it interprets it as some kind of a threat because this squeaking sound is threatening. The reason that is threatening is because of evolution. From years of evolution, when we were little baby, all these little squeaking sounds are actually made by babies crying. So as adults, when we hear the sound of a baby, we panic. Right? Unconsciously, there is a sense of panic. And that is that is a kind of very minor kind of fear reaction. Right? All this is happening in the body. So just moving on, because of all these bodily conditions, tensions in the body, we begin to feel it, bodily sensations, and this is dukkha. We feel it, the sourness you felt, the tingling sensation you felt when I talked about the chalkboard. All these are a kind of stress, dukkha, some kind of dukkha. And because of that, mental proliferation kicks in. The emotional aspect of papancha. That means the papancha that tries to interpret how does this affect me? And this kicks in. And this kicks in with memory, imagination, expectation. Memory tries to bring up past experiences to connect with what you have just experienced. Imagination tries to imagine a future, a more satisfactory future that hasn't happened yet. Expectation tries to change the present moment. So these three things are happening on the past, the present, and the future. Memory, drawing from the past. Imagination, trying to create a future that hasn't happened yet. Expectation is trying to place demands on the present moment. So this is all happening, and because of that happening, we begin to experience what is called lobha, dosa, moha. Lobha is the lust to want more of something pleasurable. Dosa is the aversion, the ill will towards or the anger towards something that is painful or unpleasant. Right? And moha is the delusion that arises with all this. So all this is happening because of our emotional nature. Right? And when that happens, we begin to want to do something. We have an intention, and then that intention leads to action. And every action has a consequence. So the intention is cetana, the action is kamma, and the consequence of our action is vipāka. And this consequence of action affects us because it affects the environment, and the environment affects us. So this is a complete chain reaction. If we react in an unwholesome manner, the other party, the people affected, will react likewise, and then we get affected by their reactions. Right? So these are all external vipāka. Right? So just moving on, I want to focus more on the process of perception, because I spoke about this, I think 2 talks ago, talking about perception to stress. But now let's get on to talking about the process of perception. Now this is very interesting. I think some of you have probably never realized this, but let's go on and then you can see what I mean. How do we perceive sensory objects? Right? So when we talk about sense stimulations, environmental activities stimulate our sense organs. So when the sense organ is stimulated, what happens? In terms of seeing, we're not really seeing the object. What are we seeing? We're seeing reflected light. Light reflected from the object stimulates these light-sensitive cells in the back of the eye, in the retina part of the eye. Right? These cells are cones and rod cells. That's all it is. We see because these cell-like sensitive cells in the back of the eyeball are being stimulated by light. We hear because of air vibration, right, arriving at the eardrum, right, stimulating the eardrum, vibrating the eardrum, which then in turns vibrate 3 little bones, and these 3 little bones vibrate a part of the sense organ called the cochlea, which then sends signals to the brain. So all these are sending signals to the brain. Touch is the same. The touch receptor under our skin. Smell is because of molecules in the air striking at these receptor cells in our smell organ, olfactory bulb they call it. And taste is because the same thing. These taste molecules, flavor molecules, react chemically with our sense in the tongue, right? The sense of taste, these taste buds in the tongue, these receptors in the tongue. So this is how we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. We are not seeing the object. We are not hearing the sound. We are seeing light reflected from the object. We are hearing air vibrations produced by the sound. These stimulations arouse feeling, vedana, and sensation, sanya. Again, the word sanya traditionally was translated as perception. my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji, translate it as sensation. And scientifically, this is more correct. Sensation is the sensing of stimulation. And that's what sanya is, the sensing of stimulation in the nervous system. So let's look on. We take a look at the pañca-khandha. There are 5 khandhas, right? And these are the 5 aggregates. My teacher calls them the 5 cumulatives, or he calls it, or another term is the 5 accumulations. So the 5 cumulatives. These 5 cumulatives interact in such a way they produce the process of perception. So collectively, I would call them process of perception. First is Vedana and Sanya. They go together. They are inseparable. When something stimulates the sense organ, that contact stimulating the sense organ is creating a sensation, Sanya. At the same time, that sensation is producing a feeling, Vedana, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. Now bear in mind, this feeling is not the emotional feeling we're thinking of. Emotion has not kicked in yet. At this point in time, it is just a feeling of whether the stimulation or the sensation is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Okay? So, and then there is a construction going on. In this case, I'm talking about the mental construction in the mind. Because the Vedana and the Sanya actually stimulate the sense organs, the nerves bring the information to the brain, and then the brain processes it. Therefore, this processing puts the message together, puts the image together. This putting of image together is a mental construction called sankhara. And when it puts together, what does it put together? It puts together a perception of something I have just seen, heard, smell, taste, or touch. And then with this perception arises a mental image. Now you have a mental image of what you thought you saw, or what you recognize to be, you've seen something. So let's take a look at these 5 processes. We talk about Vedana, and we talk about Sanya. These 2 go together. The moment the sense organ is being stimulated, Sanya, Vedana arises. So let's take a look at seeing. What happens when we see? Color does not exist out there. What we are seeing is light frequency. Right? Light reflected from an object entering our eye, depending on the frequency of that light, we then interpret it to be color. So color does not exist out there. So let's take a look at this short clip.
Some scientists claim the simple act of seeing a color triggers a spontaneous reaction in the nervous system. This is automatic. It isn't caused by any association, but by the wavelength of the color. Objects reflect light at different wavelengths. Our brain interprets these wavelengths as different colors, from blue, the shortest wavelength, through green and yellow, to red, the longest. The long wavelengths, the reds and oranges, are said to arouse the nervous system. Heart rate and blood pressure increase. The short wavelengths, the blues and violets, are meant to relax the nervous system.
Okay, that's a short one. I'll show it again later on. I'll just explain a couple of things first, and then I'll show it one more time. So, actually what is happening is that we have 5 physical senses that is sensing the environment. What I've just shown you is basically the sense of sight. So that is because we are picking up light reflected, but there is also the other 4 senses. So these 5 physical senses carry information into the brain, and then the brain processes it. And that processing is the 6th sense, the mano, or cognition. Cognition is the brain's ability to process stimulus from the environment and try to understand what has been perceived. So that is the 6th sense. But in this processing, it always refers to memory of past experiences. So in other words, when we speak of the 5 senses, the stimulus is from the environment. When we speak of the 6th sense, the stimulus is basically the collective activity of these 5 senses, the pañca-khandha, as well as our memory. Our memory of past experiences is the input to our 6th sense. And it is the memory that often brings us a lot of suffering too. remembering things that are unpleasant. You know, human beings are very strange creatures. We are the only creature, right, that regrets the past, fearful of the future, and never satisfied with the present moment. That's human beings. If you think about an animal compared with a human being, if you forgot to feed your children the whole day, you went out the whole day, came back, and your children were hungry, would they greet you with happy face and smiling, or would they look very upset because you forgot to give them food before you left the house? Yeah. But think about your dog. If you forgot to feed your dog the whole day and you went out and came back late at night, the poor dog is so hungry. The moment you open the gate, you come in and he sees you. What does he do? Does he frown at you, or does he wag his tail happily? Yeah. But humans don't do that, huh? If you forgot to feed pardon the phrase, but forgot to feed some elderly at home, they can't cook for themselves, you come back at night and they're very hungry, you think they'll be greeting you with a great big smile? But the dog will. So humans are the only species on this planet that regrets the past, fearful of the future, and unhappy or dissatisfied with the present moment. Because of this mano, drawing on memory, remembering the terrible things of the past. Remembering something terrible makes you regret that it ever happened. Remembering something wonderful makes you regret that it is all over. Whether it is wonderful or whether it is painful, there is still a sense of regret. And that is suffering. Okay, so basically these are the 6 sensual realms, how they interact with each other. Let's talk about this sensation and feeling, sanya, vedana. Stimulation of sense organ give rise to this sensation, sanya. The detection of stimulus from the environment. That's what sensation is. In terms of sight, seeing, the sensation refers to sensing of the wavelength. Right? Wavelength is interpreted as color. Sensing of the wavelength and the intensity of the light. In terms of hearing, it is the sensation that is referring to sensing of the vibration. And the air vibration carries a certain frequency. And that frequency is interpreted in the brain as a pitch, whether it's a high-pitched sound or a low-pitched sound. And the amplitude, which is loudness, whether it is loud or it is soft. Okay? So that is basically sensation. Sensing the frequency of the light or sensing the frequency of the air vibration. Seeing or hearing. And so on. So I'll just focus on these 2 senses. In fact, mainly the sense of sight, easier to explain. Then when we talk about feeling, sensation and feeling go together. They arise simultaneously. They're inseparable. When you sense something, you feel something. Okay? So feeling is this vedana. This is not an emotional feeling. This is not the feeling as a result of memory. This is purely the feeling as a result of your nervous system. And how is that so? When you're seeing things, right, feeling refers to how the nervous system reacts to the wavelength. So certain wavelengths actually arouse and irritate your nervous system. Long wavelengths, which represent the color red, orange, and yellow. They actually arouse. As you know, red light is very irritating, right? And high intensity is also irritating. So they arouse feelings in the nervous system. And they are soothed by short wavelength. So in other words, green and blue color is soothing. So why do we react like that? This is the result of evolution. We have no control over this, but because of evolution, we naturally react in a very irritated manner to red, yellow, and orange light. Whereas when it comes to blue and green light, we react in a more peaceful manner. And we like it more, so to speak. So the feeling is more pleasant. So this vedana is pleasant. If the light is blue or green, vedana is unpleasant and painful if it is red, orange, or yellow, generally speaking. Okay? The same with hearing. High-pitched sound irritates us. Low-pitched sound tend to be more soothing. Just imagine, you think of a sound of a very shrill sound. Somebody with a high-pitched voice. He speaks in a very high-pitched voice. It's very irritating. But think of a person who has a very low-pitched voice and he speaks to you in a low-pitched manner. And that is a bit more soothing. Yeah? because we react to it as a result of the way we have evolved. Our senses have evolved. So now let's take a look at the same thing again. So now you can see some of the words there and probably, hopefully, understand a little bit more.
Some scientists claim the simple act of seeing a colour triggers a spontaneous reaction in the nervous system. This is automatic. It isn't caused by any association, but by the wavelength of the colour. Objects reflect light at different wavelengths. Our brain interprets these wavelengths as different colours, from blue, the shortest wavelength, through green and yellow, to red, the longest. The long wavelengths, the reds and oranges, are said to arouse the nervous system. Heart rate and blood pressure increase. The short wavelengths, the blues and violets, are meant to relax the nervous system.
So Vedana is the way the nervous system reacts to this light frequency. Now let's take a look at Sankhara, which is the mental construction. Now all this Vedana and Sanya, from a scientific point of view, they are carried into the brain. Millions of these signals come into the brain, and then it's constructed into an image. So I'm going to show you this very interesting thing, which I think many of you are not aware, but hopefully it will help you understand better why things are so impermanent out there. Okay, basically, as far as Sankhara is concerned, there are three kinds of Sankhara. There is the mental part of Sankhara, there is the verbal part of Sankhara, and there is the physical part of Sankhara. Here we are going to focus on the mental part, the Vedana Sanya, the Sankhara resulting from Vedana Sanya. Okay. Take a look at this image. I want you to experience this. Take a look at this image. We know who she is. I want you to focus your attention on both her eyes. And now pay attention, be mindful to what's happening in your eyeball. Look at both her eyes at the same time. Can you see both her eyes at the same time? Or are your eyeballs darting back and forth between the two eyes? How many of you think you're seeing both her eyes at the same time? Nobody. How many of you realize your eyeball is really darting back and forth between the two eyes? Yeah. If you're mindful, you will realize that. That is really what is happening to us. We are not seeing an image as a whole. The eyeball is darting around, picking up bits and pieces. These bits and pieces are the little Sanya Vedana that is being picked up. Bits and pieces that is being picked up. And all these bits and pieces are millions of them every moment. Every one moment, there's 100 million of these going on. They are brought to the brain and then compiled together, constructed into a mental image. That construction is Sankhara. So let's take a look at how that works. Your eyeball is made of something at the back called the retina, where at the small part of the retina, a very small portion of the retina, 1/3 of a square millimeter. If you think of 1 millimeter, 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter is 1 square millimeter. Think of an area 1/3 that size. That's how small this little part at the back of your brain is. At the back of the retina is. Here, the fovea. 1/3 of a square millimeter. And inside there is jam-packed 100 million light-sensitive cells. Light comes in, it strikes the retina, and at the part where the fovea is, that is the part where we are able to focus. Very small little part, 1/3 of a square millimeter. And in there are two categories of light-sensitive cells, rods and cones. Rod cells are the ones you see in black. They sense shades of gray, blurry images. They are not sharp. Cone cells are the ones that sense specific range of light frequency. Not one frequency, but a range. So there is one kind of cone cells that sense red, another kind of cone cells that sense green, and another kind of cone cells that sense blue. 3 different kinds of color. That's all we are seeing. Our eyeball is capturing wavelengths ranges in only 3 ranges: red, green, and blue. And each stimulated cell, each stimulated cone or rod cell sends that information to the brain. And jam-packed inside there is approximately 120 million cells. That is how much information is going to the brain. These 120 million cells are stimulated simultaneously, sending this information continuously. It's not like just one time 120 million. It is continuously 120 million, 120 million, 120 million, happening very, very fast. A very small fraction of a second, 120 million signals go to the brain. And the brain has to construct this into an image. So when you're seeing something, you're actually picking up all over bits and pieces of that image and constructing it in the brain. So let's take a look at this construction process.
Ophthalmologist Dr. Bill Elwood takes a snapshot of the back of the eye.
What you can see here are blood vessels running over the surface of the retina, and beneath them are light-sensitive cells, which allow you to see.
Lining the inside of each eyeball, there are over 100 million light-sensing cells. But only the bigger cone cells see in colour. And amazingly, only in one tiny area of each eye are there enough of these cone cells jam-packed tightly together for sharp colour vision.
Most of the retina gives you vision which is quite blurry, apart from this very small area in the middle.
Just that smudge that we can see there.
This little smudge here that gives you really fine, detailed vision.
And that bright spot is even odder, an area which is completely blind.
That's where all the blood vessels come in and out, and where all the optic nerve fibres go back to the brain. And there's so much going on there that there aren't actually any light-sensitive cells in that area. And that corresponds to your blind spot. So it is a very odd design.
So if our eyes are designed with a blind spot and a mostly blurred image, how do we see the world in such intricate detail and vivid colour? The patchy image made at the back of the eye is just the beginning of how we see. As our eyes dart around, we make sure that anything interesting is lined up on our sharp spot, so we get a good look at it. And you don't know you're doing it, because the brain takes these jerky snapshots and creates a nice smooth movie of the world. And the brain also compensates for the blind spot. Because our eyes give us slightly different images, we can combine them to give one complete picture.
So this is amazing, huh? How many of you actually didn't realize this? Yeah, many of us. When I first saw that, I was completely dumbfounded. And then I realized when you look at an image now, look at anything around here, you are not seeing the whole image. Your eyeball is darting around, back and forth, right? So it's darting around from one spot to another spot with only that little spot that is focused and in color. The rest is in black and white, in gray shades, right? And it is blurred. And then because we have two eyes, we're able to actually merge the image and get a sense of depth. As a result of merging this image, we get a sense of depth, right? And then we think we are seeing the whole picture. If you look around you, you think you are seeing the whole room. But you are actually, your eyeball is really darting around, picking up 120 million pairs of Vedana Sanya at any one moment in time, continuously sending to the brain. That is what's going on inside the brain. Continuously, non-stop, 120 million, like a tsunami going to the brain, and the brain is trying to cope with processing it. Right? And this processing is trying to construct that image. So therefore, take a look again. Are you seeing the whole of Sitinohaliza? Or are you really, your eyeball is darting around looking at bits and pieces of her face? Now you realize a little bit of mindfulness of what's going on in your eyeball, you will understand what I mean. You are not seeing the whole of her face. Your eyeball is darting around bits and pieces, trying to pick up that image. So we are seeing in jigsaw puzzle manner. Okay? So that is sankhara, how it is constructed, and then gives rise to this perception, an understanding that now I've seen something. And this perception gives rise to a mental image that arises. Oh, now I have seen something. All right? So this is really how this 5 aggregates really work in that sense. I'm only presenting the scientific aspect of it. Of course, there is a more deeper explanation to this, but I'll just show you, I've only shown you the scientific part of it. So therefore, when you think you're seeing an object, all that is happening is light reflected from the object, striking your sense organ, and when you pay attention, the process of perception gives rise to a mental image. You are not seeing an object. You are seeing light reflected from the object. And that is the experience you're having. Therefore, we can only speak of experience. And then the mind projects and breaks it into 2 parts, the part that is the self and the part that is the world. So this is how actually also the self arises. But that is a subject to another talk, how the self arises from a scientific perspective. So basically, we should be able to understand how we are now perceiving things. And this is a very, very important message, that what we're seeing, what we think we're seeing, is happening in such high speed. It is so impermanent. This is really a very important lesson about anicca, that everything is so impermanent. Things arise dependent on the presence of necessary conditions. Anything affecting the way we are seeing will affect what we see and how we interpret what we see. So how do we interpret what we see? The mind is made of these 3 parts. The perception, which is vijnana, because of the pañca-khandha. Then we have the cognition, right, mano, which is the rational interpretation of the perception, giving meaning to what was perceived. And then we have the iccita, which is the affection, right, the emotional interpretation of how it affects us. And because of that, we begin to personalize this and think there is a sense of self as a result of that. So now, very quickly, how we react to this emotional arousal. So first, we have this sense organ being stimulated, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. Perception arises, we interpret what it is, right? So this is how we interpret what it is.
Take a look at this object. One glance and you know what it is. But how do you know what it is and where it's positioned in space? Well, let's break it down. The light reflected by this object is converted by your eyes into an electrical signal and is sent down a neurological pathway called the optic nerve to the back of your brain. Starting in this region, called the visual cortex, the image is cross-referenced with memory of past experiences stored throughout your brain as you try to identify the object. Once it's figured out what it is, your brain has to decide how the object is positioned in space.
So we recognize something because of memory of past experiences. So we then interpret what it is, and after that we begin to interpret how it affects us, and it triggers biochemical chain reaction in the body. And then we begin to feel these bodily sensations, and that makes us feel uncomfortable, the discomfort resulting from that. And then memory, imagination arise to deal with this discomfort, and therefore it leads to lobha, dosa, moha. If it is something pleasurable, we want more. If it is something painful, we want to get rid of it. And all this is basically the delusion that arises. And then we begin to take action, to do something, to try to change our environment. Okay? So let's take a look at this emotional reaction.
Fear is the body's automatic, involuntary response to a threat. Imagine that you're with a friend, walking to your car. It's a place you know. You're talking, your guard is down. What happens next happens fast. The sudden appearance of a threat first registers in a small part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is always working, constantly searching for danger. When it spots a threat, it sounds an alarm. Our autonomic nervous system, which controls functions we aren't conscious of, like breathing, goes into overdrive. In a matter of seconds, the body prepares for battle. A tidal wave of chemicals shoots into the bloodstream. Stimulants like adrenaline and cortisol that speed up your heart and send blood rushing to your muscles. Now your mind and body are running fast, which changes your perception of time. Everything seems to slow down. You may look as if you're frozen in terror, but in a matter of seconds, you're gathering data and making decisions. Your first instinctive response may be to wrestle the knife from the mugger. This is when another part of the brain, the hippocampus, steps in. The amygdala is your emotional gut. The hippocampus is your logical head. The hippocampus asks questions like, is my attacker stronger or faster than me? Do I know how to fight him? Am I going to get myself and my partner killed? Unfortunately, the hippocampus doesn't always do its job. The amygdala responds instantly and emotionally. The hippocampus takes longer, sometimes too long to do us any good. The amygdala is our Stone Age brain. Jumpy, always waiting for the next attack. It was designed to produce two responses to fear: fight or flight. The fight or flight response is an unthinking physical reaction to threats, a primitive response. So it follows that some of our deepest fears are holdovers from a primitive age.
So basically, when we are faced with dangers and threats, if we have never seen or experienced it before, we freeze. But if we have seen or experienced it before, we either try to fight it or we try to run away from it, or flight. So it's fight or flight. And I mentioned earlier on, it causes reactions in the body. Hormones are released. So when we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, it causes the release of hormones. Every time we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something. The only difference is whether these hormones come out strongly, so we can experience it or we realize it, or they are so mild we don't even realize it, okay? So we're constantly flooded with these kinds of stress hormones. I show you the other picture here. So when we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, the brain interprets it, and if it detects it may be something threatening or fearful, it sends a message to the glands. Adrenal gland is one of them. So the adrenal gland releases adrenaline and cortisol, which then floods the bloodstream and gets circulated through our blood circulation system to various parts of the body, affecting different organs. And it causes the lungs to try to take in more oxygen. It causes the heart to beat faster. It causes the intestine or digestive system to stop, because the digestive system draws up too much energy from the body. Now you need to conserve energy to fight this threat. It causes various muscles to tense up. That's why people feel tension in the body. They feel muscle very tensed. They feel stiffness in the body. So people who are often stressed will often experience stiffness in the body because of all this. And then it causes the hair to stand on end. This is this is the remnant of evolutionary past. But we do experience it. It's called goose pimple. So when we experience goose pimple, that is your hair standing on end. Right? It causes pupils to dilate. That means your eye open up bigger to try to see more. It causes facial expression to distort. That's why when people are angry or fearful, their face is distorted. You don't see people who are angry and fearful, the face very peaceful and calm. That doesn't happen. And you can see here, hair standing on end, facial distortion, pupils dilate, facial distortion, right? Muscles tense. and then the blood sugar level rises to help this metabolism to convert stored energy to readily available energy to fight this threat. And finally, immune system is suppressed. If you look at all this, this is all extremely unhealthy. Being stressed is a very unhealthy thing. So we have to be careful of our senses. When we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch something, and we begin to react to it emotionally, it is very stressful. It causes our body to go into this kind of condition where it is very unhealthy. So we have to watch that. So very often when we experience this kind of sensations in the body, it makes us angry, and then we begin to react without thinking. When we begin to react without thinking, we are not mindful of our karma anymore. But always remember, whenever somebody arouses our anger, somebody threatens us and makes us feel angry about it, what they do to us, it is their karma. Right? How others hurt us, but how we react is our own karma. So we have to watch it, because if we react in an emotional manner, it actually makes our body very unhealthy. Not only talking about the unwholesome deeds that may arise, but the body itself becomes unhealthy when we react emotionally. So when somebody pisses you off, sorry for the word, but this is a very down-to-earth thing. When somebody pisses you off, just sit on the problem for a while. Think about it. Pause. Think before you react. Don't do that. Huh? When I say sit on the problem, I don't mean that. But basically, when something happens, think about it. Pause and think and consider the consequence of your action, right? Your karma, before you actually react. And think about how to create a more wholesome environment for the two parties, instead of just reacting unconsciously like an animal. So there are consequences to our reaction. These consequences are called vipāka. Internal consequences as well as external consequences. Internal consequences I've already described to you. That is the stress reaction. Right? It comes in three parts: alarm reaction, stage of resistance, and stage of exhaustion. These were described by an endocrinologist by the name of Hans Selye about 70, 80 years ago, where he described stress conditions. But the Buddha has already also described it very clearly in the sutra. Those 5 conditions: sokha, parideva, dukkha, domanassa, and upayasa. Okay, these are the 5 conditions which affect which are the internal consequences to our reactions. There are also external consequences to our reactions. These are the external consequences in relation to the opposite party. That means what we do to other people. In relation to society, what we do to the community. And in relation to the law of the land, whether we're breaking the law by doing something illegal, like killing or something like that. And in relation to the environment, are we destroying the environment which we live in, or the peaceful and harmony of the environment that we are in? And finally, in relation to matters arising after death. What happens as a result after we die as a result of that? The karma we carry on to our later lives. So these are the external consequences. So in conclusion, sensory experiences are dependent on the presence of the necessary conditions. And these conditions are unstable and unreliable. That is what anicca really means. Right? That these conditions are unstable, unreliable. Then our mind begins to interpret what we experience. Right? Interpret this sense experience by referring to memory, imagination, expectation. We can't stop that. It happens automatically. But we can actually play it down. We can actually think about it before we react. But when we don't think about it and begin to react, it becomes a pressure to us. And that causes various things happening in the body. The mind and body are intertwined. In psychology, this is called psychosomatic condition, where the mind, the body are intertwined. And this leads to this unconscious emotional reaction that disturbs the mind. And because of that, that is dukkha. The mind is being disturbed. Dukkha. And finally, this disturbance leads to us personalizing the experience. Why is he hurting me? The I and the me become very strong. Right? We personalize every experience we have. But the fact remains, we can't personalize because life is an impersonal process. We are just organisms in an environment, and consciousness of the experience is really a very impersonal process that is continuously ongoing. Our environment is continuously stimulating our senses, and our mind is continuously processing these sense stimulations, trying to react to it. The whole thing is so impersonal. There is no self to consider. The reality is anatta. There is no self to consider. It is all a process of determinism. Right? Paticca samuppada, continuously happening around us. So this is really what is happening. These are the realities of life. Okay? So therefore, to overcome that, I'm not even talking about meditation. I'm talking about something very simple. First, guard your senses. Refrain from unwholesome stimulations or conditioning from the environment. The second one, minimize mental proliferation that draws on memory, imagination, expectation, because they actually can cause havoc to your interpretation. Third, pay attention to your bodily sensation. Pay attention to emotional arousals, especially these bodily sensations. When you experience heart rate rising, when you experience your breathing deepening, when you experience your voice level going up or the pitch of your voice rising, when you experience body trembling, when you experience blood pressure rising or body temperature rising, realize something has happened that aroused your emotions. Be mindful of that. Think about it before you respond. Realize that these bodily sensations are actually a message to you to realize, do not react in an unwholesome manner. Think first. Therefore, pause and think before reacting. Right? And finally, whatever you want to do, consider the consequence of every reaction that you're going to take or response. So basically, this is the very simple, basic practice of mindfulness, not even talking about meditation. Simple things that we can do in our daily lives around us, moment to moment. And as all the Buddhas have taught us, abandon the evil ways. Enter the good life and learn to purify our mind, cultivate our mind for wholesomeness, because this is the teachings of all the Buddha. And if we can do that, when we are faced with these changing vicissitudes of life, if the mind can be kept undisturbed, free from worry, lust, and fear, this is the supreme bliss. And this was explained very well in the Mangala Sutta. Thank you very much for coming. Right.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.